Hello, everyone. Today is November 9th, 2022. I'm here today with Bob Keane. Bob is a research fire ecologist and the host of Fire Ecology Chats. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Bob.
I really appreciate it, Koresh. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to love talking to your audience.
I think my audience will really appreciate what you have to say. So, how did you get into the field of research fire ecology?
Okay, long time ago, I had a high school job in a wildlife refuge in Maine, and one of my bosses there was a teacher that taught in Maine and had a student that came out here and worked at the fire lab in Missoula. And at the end of the summer, that boss got me a job with that guy that worked at the fire lab. And once I got to the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab, I was hooked. It was all fire all the time. And I just enjoyed linking the fields of fire and ecology together. And never a dull moment. And just it was never a job that I figured it was a true job. I was actually doing a lot of stuff I actually loved. So it was a lot of fun. So I guess I got to it way back in high school.
That's amazing. You found something in high school that you were passionate about and able to continue that. What did you do during that job?
At that time, I was hired as an ecological modeler. And one of the reasons I was hired was because I could program code. I knew how to write in Fortran. But of course, when you write a program, you have to do all the research in order to know how to code the algorithms that go in a model. And after that, it was because of my knowledge of computers and how to write a computer model was really what got me all the jobs I had in fire ecology, pretty much all my life. And as such, I spent about 40% of my time doing ecological modeling in fire ecology and another 40% of my time doing, field-based fire ecology. So I really enjoyed doing the both, and it really gave me a context in which to do my research.
So the two forms of modeling are fire-based ecology or fire-based modeling and ecological modeling.
Yes, that's correct. Fire, to model the spread and intensity of fire, you really have to know the physics, and you really have to know, all the equations that are involved in heat transfer. While at the same time, if you're going to predict what the effect of the fire would be on the ecology, you really have to know the literature on the physiology of plants and the how a plant grows and how a plant can survive fire and so on. So it's a great melding of the two to find where fire modeling melds to ecological modeling. And it was a very delightful career. I just enjoyed it. And it was so much fun to do it.
Wow, that's awesome. What was the state of fire ecology when you entered the field modeling in high school?
Oh, it was, many people were doing fire ecology, but most of it was related to fire management and not to actual, what fire does to the plants, animals, flora, and fauna of the area. Since I started doing research in 1979, and the amount of fire ecology research that has been done since 1979 is phenomenal. And the reason, of course, is because as we've had climate change and as more forests have burned across the United States, there have been more and more money generated to finding out exactly how we can manage fire in the best ways. And I will tell you this, it's not by building a bigger and better fire model that's going to really answer the questions. It's going to be by understanding the ecology of the area, which will then allow you to then model or predict what the fuels would be that the fire would burn in order to solve a fire dilemma that we have in the future. In other words, should we fight fires or should we let them burn? And to me, fire ecology is the context in which we should be looking at the solution to that problem.
What do you mean by should we fight fires or should we let them burn?
Well, there's a substantial cost in the fighting fires. First of all, there's the human cost, which is people can get killed, people can get hurt, people's property can be, burned and so on. So there's that. And obviously, we should put out fires when they are around dwellings and when they're, threaten human life. But if a fire is way out in the middle of a wilderness, right, it's like, should we fight it and spend all that money to fight it? When the sum total of fighting the fire means that the land doesn't burn. And because the land doesn't burn, biomass keeps on accumulating. And when biomass keeps on accumulating, we have more fuels out there. And because we have more fuels, the next fire will be even more intense and more severe. It may even threaten homes and property because they're so severe and intense. Whereas if we let the fires burn, fires have been burning ecosystems for millennia here in the American West. And if we let these fires burn, it will reduce the fuels and it will hopefully help the fire ecology of the area by keeping the area in fire adapted plants. And therefore, it becomes more resilient and more able to survive the next fire and the next fire after that. So the cost of fighting or suppressing fires is really both financial in that, it takes a lot of money, millions of dollars to fight even one single fire, juxtaposed to the fact that if we fight them and are successful, which sometimes we rarely are, but if we are successful, fuels will just keep on accumulating in those lands that didn't burn, and we'll have a bigger and more dangerous fire later. So it's a unique enigma and paradox, and in order to understand it fully, we really have to delve into ecology. Another big predicting the spread and intensity of fire is important, but not nearly as important as understanding the fire ecology of the area. And of course, when I say fire ecology, I mean understanding the fuels, because the fuels are a result of ecological processes.
Fuels. What do you mean by fuels?
Okay, when we talk about, if we go to the field of fire, oftentimes fire models need a collection of components in which to model the spread of fire. And these components are ways in which we describe fuels. And right now, fuels are described, and this is really broad terms, but fuels are described as woody fuels, down dead woody fuels. And there are 4 categories: 1 hour, 10 hour, 100 hour, and 1,000 hour. And those are based on how fast they dry. And then we have shrubs, we have herbs, which are both live and dead. We have the duff, we have the litter, and then we have the crown fuels, the fuels that are live in the trees. And so that basically is the fuel components that we use to describe fire modeling. Now, those components are completely different than how an ecologist would describe the biomass that's in a particular area. So one of the hard things in fire science research is meshing the fields of ecology with the fields of fire so that they talk to each other with the same language and the same classifications and the same everything. And for instance, 1 hour, 10 hour, 100,000 hour fuels are logs, and these things are 3 inches and greater. These are down dead things that are on the ground that are woody, and they are 3 inches and greater. Now, the decay, if we're going to predict the decay of a log, we really need to know how big it is, because the decay of a 3-inch log is going to be a lot faster than the decay of a 30-inch log. So that classification of 1,000-hour fuels is way too broad for ecology. So we have to divide that up if we're going to be ecologists and so on. So this is what I mean by melding and merging the two fields together so that they have a common language.
And if we break up those classifications of burn rates, that involves more research, more fine-tuned data, which goes to what you said earlier. We need to go out there and do the research and not create necessarily a bigger model, because a bigger model with not sufficient data, it won't solve the problems we're looking to solve.
Yeah, that's correct. We have a usable fire model for managers. It will predict fire spread and growth across landscapes and so on. But the next big step will be to go out and do the research to understand how a fire burns. What is the difference between convection and conduction and radiation and so on, and parse out those things. And these are what my colleagues at the Fire Sciences Lab in Missoula are trying to do. I've got colleagues that are developing what they call computational fluid dynamics models, where they simulate very fine grids of fire across three-dimensional landscapes. And then we have people using the burn chamber to find out how exactly a fire will burn, which is something we never knew before. On the other end of the coin, as ecologists, we never really understood how a fire affects a tree and what it does. And I also have colleagues at the Fire Lab that study how fire damages or aids a tree and so on, and looks at how the tree will survive, if the tree is in better health after the fire or in worse health, or so on. So it's a unique melding of the fields in order to understand this. And, as people that live in the United States, it's important to know that there are studies that predict, the fire return interval for the entire United States was around 24 years. And in the
what does that mean?
That means that at any piece of ground in the United States, a fire would burn it every 24 years. So in the Mountain West, that fire return interval was much lower. It was probably between 10 and 20, which means that there was a lot of fire historically, started by both lightning and Native Americans. So it's not, we are in a fire-dominated continent. And we, historically, we've had a lot of fire. And so a lot of the plants and animals have adapted to fire prior to European settlement. And so it's really incumbent on us to make sure we keep the nature of that landscape intact and its ecological resilience and integrity intact.
Yes. And how to do that is not necessarily obvious. You mentioned that one of the big questions in research fire ecology is put it out or let it burn. And has that, what have you found over the years? Has the research on that changed over the years, or what has been the consensus amongst fire ecologists and research fire ecologists?
I will tell you this, is that we have known the adverse effects of fire exclusion, which is suppressing fire, for a long time. Back in 1942, this guy Weaver wrote a paper that said, we probably shouldn't be putting out all fires because these forests have evolved with fire. Even Gifford Pinchot, the father of American forestry, recognized the role that fire had in the ecosystems of the West. And this was in like 1910. But the problem is that we had a bunch of foresters that were trained in European procedures that came to America and began to believe that fire was, an evil thing, and that we should get rid of it and try to eliminate it and treat it like a bug or a disease, rather than recognize that it is an incredibly important part of our ecosystem, and it's the one single thing that keeps everything healthy. So we've known about fire and its role in American ecology for a long time. But the problem is that now, as human development continues to go and out in the woodlands, is that we have more and more people exposed to fire. And these people just do not like smoke. So doing proactive burning around these places is really, really difficult, if not impossible. And it's these proactive fuel treatments involving prescribed fire that will be important to make sure that these homes don't get burned by large fires in the future. But again, people, because they don't see a lot of fire in their in their lifetime, they tend to believe that, oh, I will just live with fire, and if it burns my house, it'll burn my house. And then we'll continue to label fire as a catastrophe and a tragedy, when all it is an ecological process that we can actually manage and put it back in the ecosystem itself.
How do you believe we can manage it?
We have one thing that we know as in American forestry and in American land management is we know how to cut trees and do ecologically viable cuttings that will not only return the historical structures and compositions of forest in the past before European settlement, but it will also serve as a fuel treatment to protect homes and people when the next fire burns. So we have the knowledge to do that, and we can always make ecological models and fire models better. But right now we know exactly how to thin forests in order to make it fire resilient and resistant. The only thing that is stopping us is funding. It's public participation and public approval. So it's a real enigma. Is that ecologists have known what to do for a while, and we also recognize the fact that fire isn't needed in every part of the landscape. There are high elevation systems like lodgepole or whitebark pine or spruce fir, where these fuel treatments may not be necessary because it's far away from people, and that we could just allow these wildfires to burn if they do burn. So it's not everywhere in the United States that needs a fuel treatment. It's, we could prioritize doing fuel treatments around human settlements and whatever, and then move out from there. But if we don't, we are going to lose valuable relics, trees that are 400 years old, that have survived tens of fires, tens and almost maybe 100 fires, and yet they will burn down in the next fire because there is so much fuel on the ground from constant fire exclusion.
So you said a word, fuel. You mentioned it 2 times. Fuel, when we eliminate the biomass that's in the ecological system, and you mentioned cutting down trees. When we also talk about removing fuel, do you mean prescribed fire as well?
Yes, I mean using both prescribed fire and silvicultural cuttings as a mean to eliminate or reduce both canopy fuels and fuels on the ground. And also, it's really important. A colleague of mine in the Fire Lab has done research and shown that if fire scars a tree or harms a tree, that tree will start creating resin sacs that will then protect the tree from the fire next time. So it's it will also do great ecological benefit and make the stand more resilient in the future. So there are a lot of people that are against fuel treatments. I'm not saying that we should do them everywhere, and I'm not advocating fuel treatments everywhere, but there are certainly places that we could do fuel treatments that will be effective. Now, there are a lot of people, there's some research to show that some fuel treatments are very ineffective or not effective at all in preventing fire. But we have to know that the objective and aim of a fuel treatment is not to reduce fire, because fire will always happen and there'll always be organic matter on the ground. The objective of a fuel treatment is to reduce fire intensity. In other words, how much or how big that fire will get and how intense it will be, and allow for people to go ahead and suppress fires, right? If they are proven that they will harm people or homes. In other words, we can send firefighters in there, and the fire will be of such low intensity that they can actually establish a fire line and prevent it from going anywhere. So
yes,
that's the objective of a fuel treatment. And that's one of them. The other objective, of course, is to return ecological integrity.
What do you mean by ecological integrity?
I mean to to put it back, to create a stand that would have number one, be resilient to climate change in the future, and have all the aspects of fire adapted species so they can survive the fire next time. Unfortunately, the only kind of model or reference we have for that is historical stand structures. And so we often use historical stand structures, in other words, before the European settlement, in order to use as a target for how to create these using fuel treatments, how to make sure that these fuel treatments will recreate historical stand structures. Now, and then once we have the historical stand structure, we can then adapt it to make sure that we include climate change effects along with it. Plus, we can also make sure that all these fires will survive next time. All these fires won't kill all the relics, the large old trees that are typical of American forests, fire-prone forests in the past. And we can make sure that the next fire won't kill them.
Yes. So one of the biggest objectives is to not outright suppress fire, but to suppress high intensity fires, to suppress the intensity of fire so that our very old trees, firefighters, very old trees won't suffer because the fire isn't so intense that, they can't withstand it. And when firefighters go in and are needed to, say, handle a situation where a fire is encroaching on a neighborhood or on a home, it won't be so intense because there will be less biomass on the ground to fuel that fire with more intensity.
Right. And I want to get the point across is that the firefighters aren't the problem. We need firefighters. We need them to go out there and, fight fires when we have to. But the problem is that most of the time when we have a bad fire season, we're suppressing all fires. And that may be a waste of taxpayer money, and it may be counterproductive if we want to improve ecosystem health. I'd be very careful on how you use the term. It's a big thing in fire management that the term suppress means the actual suppression of the fire, meaning digging fire lines and dropping retardant loads to prevent, to suppress the fire and stop it. Fire exclusion is the policy of removing, not letting fires burn, right? And then fuel reduction is the process of manipulating the soils in the forest so that the next fire that burns will be of such low intensity that we can use suppression techniques to make sure it doesn't reach homes.
Okay. And two fuels that you mentioned were duff and litter. When you say litter, you mean people throwing trash on the ground, correct?
No. Sorry about that. I should have qualified that. No, duff and litter are two different things. Litter is a material that has fallen on the ground that hasn't decomposed yet. And this is tree needles. This is cow manure. This is, cows have been, this is leaves that have fallen on the ground. This is branches and whatever that haven't yet decomposed. Underneath the litter is the decomposition of previous litter, which we call duff. A lot of soils people say it's the organic horizon. The difference is that litter will burn in direct combustion, and it will burn as the fire progresses, and it will actually feed a fire as it goes across an area. Litter, on the other hand, only burns with smoldering combustion. And so it adds intensity below the soil because it smolders there. It doesn't add to the front of the fire as it spreads across an area, but it pulses heat through the soil over long periods as it smolders and could do damage. What?
What's the definition of smolder?
Smolder is when you don't have a flaming combustion, when there's not a flame, and it's just smoldering, and you don't have a flame actually there. And the problem with smoldering combustion, of course, is that is where most of the smoke comes from that we have in the West, from smoldering combustion of fuel that hasn't been completely consumed in the flaming part of the combustion.
And that, I think of a campfire in that, because when we put in pine needles to keep the heat, it's smoky.
Right. Yes, that's exactly the example that you should use. It's like a campfire. If you put a lot of fuel in there, you'll see a lot of flaming combustion and very little smoldering combustion. But as the flames go down and it can't reach all the organic material, you'll get to go to smoldering combustion, and that is where you'll see all the smoke.
Okay. One topic you brought up was that you don't believe every every forest, every ecological system requires fuel treatment. You also mentioned how North America lives in a continent that, historically has had fire, throughout the continent. And you mentioned that when Europeans came to America, they brought a European system of fire ecology. I'm not sure if we call it, managing fires. What is different about managing fire on the European continent compared to managing fire on the North American continent, if there is anything?
Yeah, fire is totally different in the European continent. It never really occurred historically because the land was settled by so many humans that, they now have an ecology that really isn't that fire prone, or there is a lot of fire prone species, but they were able, like German forestry was able to grow large trees, and those trees would never see fire historically before people were there. These days, however, as people in Europe move from the agricultural and forestry areas into the cities, we see more and more fires in Europe because the lack of people there to put out the fires. And so fire is becoming a problem. What happened then is that all the research in forestry that was done on German forests that had, that didn't experience a lot of disturbance. And so you can't then pick up German forestry and cookie cut it to apply to all of the United States. And so what we didn't realize is that this just was exactly the opposite of what we should do. When you try to manage a forest to put out the most timber, you're growing trees so dense that if a fire does happen, you're guaranteeing that the fire will be a crown fire and will kill everything. So that is an anathema to the, forest, the ecology or fire ecology of the area. So the two did mix. It was a square peg in a round hole. And we're now seeing, after 100 years, the results of that. And this is our fire enigma. This is why we're having so much land burned. We are not only having a lot of fire years, but we've got a lot of fuel on the landscape from 100 years of fire exclusion. And between the two of them, they really are the reason that we see so many fires doing so much damage across the West now.
Between the two of them?
Yeah, it's both the fact that we're now having a climate where we have nearly a fire season every year now, and coupled with the fact that we have 100 years of fire exclusion.
Okay, so 100 years ago, fire management in America changed?
Yeah, it was probably there's several books written on this, but there's probably the fires in 1910 and how destructive they were really ushered in probably the fire management of suppression in this country. And then many feel that by 1929 is when that fire management effort was started to be effective across the landscape. And so, 1929 is usually the date we researchers use. But if you want to be, look at social policy, you could probably say it's 1910.
Okay.
Is when the effects of suppressing fires actually occurred.
Okay. And so when you combine that, new policy of fire, it's fire exclusion, correct? It wasn't suppression after 1929.
Right. Yeah. Fire exclusion includes the fact that, we had, any fire that happened, we suppressed it. And coupled with the fact that we had a fire prevention program that told everyone, don't light fires in the forest, right? Whereas, Native Americans lit a lot of fire in the forest prior to European settlement. And when we said don't light fires, though Native Americans could light fires either. So that coupled with this policy of stopping all fires was very effective. And from 1920, after the Dust Bowl, from probably 1940 to 1970, there was a real wet phase in America, and fires. Our fire management policy was very effective and very good at putting out fires, and we caught. Well, many feel you caught between 92 and 96% of all fires in initial attack when you actually put people out there to attack it when the fire was small. So it was very effective. These days, with so many fires happening so often, and all parts of the landscape are very dry and can support a fire, it's really difficult for our fire management organizations to hit and fight every one of them.
Okay, so fire exclusion between 1940 and 1970 was very effective because it was a cool, wet period within North America.
Yeah, within that part, right? And it was also coupled with the fact that we had a lot of people out there, a lot of people fighting fire. But I'm sure the climate was one of the big reasons why it was so effective. We just didn't have a lot of fires. When I was getting my master's, the biggest fire that happened in Montana was only 29,000 acres. And now 29,000 acres is a small fire compared to, what we've been seeing in the last 20 years. So.
Okay. And as, a research fire ecologist who has extensive experience in modeling, and you're part of the Fire Science Lab?
Correct. Missoula Fire Sciences Lab.
Missoula Fire Sciences Lab. What are the models showing regarding, are you modeling, you said that you're placing climate change into your models, but how, through modeling and maybe through just the research fire ecology viewpoint, how has climate change, what has gone on within the last 40 years?
Well, really, we're seeing the climate change. Many think it's from 1988, but I think, it's, if we looked at probably 2000, last 20 years are where we really see the increase in fires across the United States. And what we've seen is that we have a longer fire season. It could be as much as 84 days longer. And now I see where the research is saying that it's maybe greater than 100 in some places in the United States, that we have a longer fire season. I also think it's the fact that it used to be that our high elevation forest systems, lodgepole, whitebark, the really high ones that really had snow on the ground for a long time. Now that snow melts. And now what we have are forests at the tops of mountains that now get dry enough so that the fires can burn up to there and burn through it. So we end up having larger fires because the high elevation areas are now dry enough to burn. And so that's another thing we're seeing. And I don't think we're seeing a lot more ignitions than we did in the past. But a lot of those ignitions would be in high elevation forests, because high elevation forests do have a big proportion in the western U.S. And a lot of those would hit the high elevation forests and then go out, or be very easy to suppress. These days now, the high elevation forests are in August, they're just as dry as below. And so we see that fires can actually start up there now, and so on. And so we're seeing not only fires, and then lastly is the fact that we have temperatures and relative humidities that are really dry out the landscape so much. And then we have days and days on end of no rain, which would mean that you have this incredible climate in which and if fire starts, they can grow to be very, very large.
Okay. Okay. And are we seeing most of the fires right now? I'm a California resident, and, the last 5 years, there's been a very hot, very intense fires here. Most of the fires that we're seeing are in these higher elevation areas. Is that correct?
I don't know much about California fires, but I do know that a lot of the high elevation areas that had the large trees, and all these large trees used to have fires that would burn them very often. Now those forests are very, very dense. And because they're so dense, the large trees that are there, the redwoods, the sequoias, and so on, are in poor health because they have to compete with all those dense seedlings and saplings that are in the understory. And those other trees are taking away water and nutrients from them. And because of this, we're seeing a lot of insects and diseases predispose those trees to mortality. And then if a fire happens, the fire will make, if a fire happens, it will be of high intensity and high severity, because it burns the seedlings and saplings, which is a lot of fuel. And then the trees are less likely to survive because they've been predisposed to damage by the insect and diseases. And so, and in these places where insects and diseases has actually killed these large trees, you see a lot of fuel build up on the ground, and these fires can be even more intense and kill the remaining trees that are surviving. But I think what you're talking about, chaparral is going to burn regardless. Those are fire-dominated shrublands, and they were going to burn, period. And so it's often just delaying the inevitable. And if you don't put fire in there proactively, those shrubs is just going to get denser and denser with more fuel on the bottom, and then burn at a higher and higher severity that's impossible to control. You can't expect firefighters to risk their lives when the flame lengths are in the hundreds of feet. It's just they can't even get near the fire when it's like that. So firefighting is totally ineffective. But it is effective if you burn these things prior when the weather is conducive to having a low intensity burn. And then when a burn does happen in high, when it's very dry, it'll be a little more manageable.
Okay. That's not, very obvious to people, that setting a fire before, if you ever seen, especially for city dwellers, it's not very obvious that this is the issue. A lot of people will just mention climate change, if climate change is a serious issue. But when you look at the model and the science, and you see that high biomass accumulation over decades, leads to more intense fires, then you realize there's an approach. It's not just, yes, climate change is very serious. Yes, we have to, acknowledge it. You mentioned placing it in the models to, finding data from before European colonization, but using modern climate change to adjust your model so that it is, you hope it's more accurate. And, I think it is. And so we can take a proactive approach here, and, we can move forward with removing this biomass, however it is, fuel. You didn't say fuel removal, fuel treatment. And, there, and it can save houses, it can save homes, lives, firefighters, and our communities.
Yeah, there are a couple downsides of fuel treatment. Number one, it's expensive. It'll be, I don't know, anywhere from $500 to $1,500 an acre, or even more. Number two, you have to treat a lot of the landscape for the fuel treatments to be effective. And this has been the problem in the past, is that many have seen fuel treatments ineffective because not enough of the area was treated. In other words, they did a fuel treatment in a 10-acre stand that was in a 100,000 acre matrix. You know what I mean? So any fuel treatment is going to be overwhelmed by the fire in that 100,000 acre matrix. It's not going to survive or whatever. And so recent research, if you look, it depends on the landscape and so on. And again, I'm only talking about fire-prone landscape. I'm not talking about those ones that aren't fire-prone at the higher elevations and so on. But in fire-prone landscapes, it looks like, you'll have to treat anywhere from 25 to 50% of the landscape in order for it to be effective. And that is a significant commitment, not only by land management agencies, but by the public. And third thing is that any proactive treatments that you're going to do is going to probably put smoke in the air. And the public really doesn't like smoke. So I guess my real take-home message here is that the solution to all this is complicated, as you mentioned. It's not, okay, we'll put out all fires or will we not put out all fires. It's very complicated. And the complication is because there's such ecological variability out there that it makes everything local and not something that we can cookie cut and apply to the entire country. So whatever we do in the future, right, it's going to have elements of what we talked about today, but it's going to have to be designed for local situations. And so I guess that's the ultimate take-home message that I really like to portray, is that from our talk, is that ecosystems are highly variable, fire ecology is highly variable, fuels are variable, and fire is variable because it depends on climate and fuels. Therefore, any solution or whatever has to embrace that variability in order to be effective.
That makes sense. And like you said, chaparrals, chaparral ecosystem isn't going to be the same as a high elevation system in the Rockies.
Right.
For many reasons. One question I have is, you mentioned the price, $500 to $1,500 an acre for fuel treatment. How does the process of a prescribed fire go?
Okay, so the first thing we have to do is we have to find a burn window in order to burn it. And so we have to, get a knowledge of the fuels that are out there, both canopy and the surface fuels. And then we put it through the models. Now, if the models show that if we put a fire in there, a prescribed fire in a particular burn window, and when I say burn window, we're specifying the fuel moistures, we're specifying the temperature of the air, we're specifying the relative humidity of the air, and so on. There are a bunch of aspects that we look at along with the fuel loadings. And if we find that the fire, if we burn, may actually kill the overstory, which we want to save, right? We will then have to use silviculture to go in and thin these forests to take out these little trees so that they will not funnel fire up into the bigger trees. And we can reduce that intensity of the fire and not kill the very element that we want to save. And so we use silviculture to modify or manipulate the fuels on the site to get a low severity fire and a low intensity fire that will then burn up all the fuels on the ground and leave what we want to leave there ecologically. In other words, if we're striving to leave large trees of a certain species, that's what we want to do. And there are a number of computer models that allow us to do this. They're all very effective, and it's not many fire managers are taught these models in classes that occur across the country.
What was that term you used? Silviculture?
Yeah, silviculture is where you design a cutting technique based on what the stand conditions are. And that the objective of that cutting technique for our purposes is to reduce canopy fuels in order to save the overstory. For instance, that would be one. So then silviculture would come in and say, okay, we have to thin trees that are less than 3 inches, and then we'll pile them and burn them in piles and so on. So it's silviculture that is the science of cutting the tree and getting at the ecological end of the spectrum. And then it's fire science that allows us to model what the fire will occur after we've manipulated these fuels and the ecosystem components.
Okay. And you mentioned that fire ecologists throughout the country are being taught modeling tools that take silviculture, that determine whether silviculture is necessary. And earlier you mentioned that when you first got into research fire ecology, you've always, been able to maintain, you've always been a programmer in that sense, of a modeler of fire research, of fire ecology. What tools are being used today by research fire ecologists to model fires?
Okay, so there are a number of computer programs. First, there is a model called FireSight, which has been integrated into spatial platforms that will simulate the growth and intensity of a fire. And it will predict where the fire will be in the future. And there are different versions of that will predict like the probability of that fire reaching a particular point and so on. Right. Then we often run computer models that will dictate how much fuel was consumed. And there is two models, one called Consume and the other called FOFEM, FOFEM, First Order Fire Effects Model, that will calculate fuel consumption. Then FOFEM will also calculate tree mortality after the fire goes through the area, and it will also calculate smoke. I think Consume calculates smoke as well. FOFEM will also calculate how much heat is pulsed through the soil, and if so much heat is pulsed through the soil, if it will be damaging to the soil biota. There is a computer model called FVS, Forest Vegetation Simulator, that allows you to simulate the effects of fire. FVS has integrated both FOFEM into its architecture so that you could simulate the effect of fire on the trees itself. And these are what foresters use in order to design silvicultural techniques before a prescribed burn. They'll often use the FVS model in order to do it, and so on. So I'm just touching on a select few. These are the ones that most people in the Forest Service use. There are other models that other people will use. These are the models that most managers will use. We fire ecologists tend to use a little more complicated models because we have to get out cause and effect and so on. And the complicated models are harder to run, so we wouldn't expect managers to be able to run them. And so, but those models I mentioned are probably the ones that most people use to simulate fire effects and so on.
Okay. So the most important thing, when I think about modeling in terms of, prescribed fire, one thing I think of Dwight Eisenhower's quote, plans are useless, but planning is, it's not exactly this, but it's something along the lines of plans are useless, but planning is absolutely critical, necessary. And it seems like that would be the case with prescribed fires, that you can't just go in there and start a fire. You really need to understand, like you said, how that overbrush, making sure that that is maintained well, and understanding how the foliage on the ground, how all the biomass on the ground is going to, and even the short trees, how the short trees are going to affect the larger trees. That's very complicated and not obvious.
Yeah. One more thing about prescribed fire. I mentioned fuel treatments and, prescribed fire, the downsides. And what I forgot to mention is the fourth point. And the fourth point is that if a prescribed fire goes out of control, right? And of course, prescribed fires can go out of control, is that, and let's say a out of control prescribed fire burns homes or whatever, then the land management agency is liable for any suits that come about. And that prevents a lot of prescribed fires from happening. So the downside of prescribed fires is that a lot of fire managers, even though they're very experienced on how to implement these prescribed fires, will do it reluctantly, because it's a career-ending event. These poor guys try to do good and help the land, and yet then they get sued or lose their jobs over it because a prescribed fire, went out of control because of an unpredicted wind gust or whatever. And so that's one of the things that precludes a lot of prescribed fire. In Australia, they have this thing called the Bushfire Act, which, as long as the fire wasn't set out of malice, that specifically states that if a fire burns onto your land and burns your property, as long as that fire wasn't set in malice, that it's really your problem, the homeowner's problem. And that's how they got around the whole suit business. So that's in a couple territories of Australia. But that is one of the biggest deterrents. That with smoke, the high cost of prescribed fires and the people's aversions of smoke, and so on, is the reasons why a lot of prescribed fire doesn't happen.
Okay. And you mentioned Australia, and when you mention Australian fires, I believe the 2019 fires they had, and was it 2019 that they had very intense?
Yeah, there were been a lot of years. Yeah, 2019. Yeah, right.
And so you mentioned this. What was the act's name?
It was called the Bushfire Act.
Bushfire Act.
It's only in the Northern Territories. I visited the Northern Territories for several months, and it was only there that they had passed it. I think other places in Australia didn't. But the Northern Territories, their fire return interval is 1.7 years.
Wow. Which
means that people there see a lot of fires.
Yes.
And because they see a lot of fires, they understand how fuel treatments are, and they actively encourage the Australian firefighters to go and put in proactive treatments to control the fire before it gets to them. And so they understand the Bushfire Act, and they understand that it's a good thing, not a bad thing.
1.7 is a very low number for, it's time between fires, 1.7 years between fires.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There are places that a fire happens every year, and, it's either, they're mostly we're set by Aboriginals. Now there's a lot set by lightning, but it's amazing how much land area burns in the Northern Territories from fire.
Oh, wow. And so they need to, and they have chosen to implement with that act, they've also chosen to implement the same sort of fuel treatment techniques. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, they have a huge prescribed fire contingent and department. And you know how much money they spend on fire suppression?
How much?
Zero.
Wow. What do you mean by that?
That they don't suppress any fires. They only start fires for fuel treatment.
What do you mean they only start fires for fuel treatment?
I'm saying if a fire happens, right, and it was not started by anyone, but started by lightning, they do not suppress it. They consider it as a fuel treatment, natural fuel treatment, and so that's part of their portfolio. Is all these fires that are started by lightning or aboriginals are fuel treatments, and as such, they are allowed to do it. So they don't. The year I was there, they spent zero on there. Now with more people settling in Darwin and around, they could be suppressing a little more. But as far as I know, they spend very little on fire suppression itself.
And the other term, fire suppression, is fire elimination. It's not elimination.
No, exclusion.
Fire exclusion.
Exclusion is the fire policy of getting rid of fires. Fire suppression is just the act of suppressing the fire or trying to put it out or limit its spread.
Okay. Wow. Then, and how long have they been implementing these fuel treatment on their lands?
That's a good question. I don't know, but it's been a while.
Okay. Wow. Then, how has the consensus among fire ecologists and research fire ecologists, has it, I usually think of these, as a spectrum. One thing that I also think of as a spectrum is the public's adversity or, interest in nuclear energy. That seems to always sway one way or the other. And has the consensus among the general public regarding research fire ecology, has it gone in the rate of prescribed fire? Is there any sort of desire for an act like this to be passed in any state within the U.S.?
No, not as far as I know, and I really can't speak to that. Those are social policy things that I'm not into that literature, and there are many that could talk about it that I could tell you about. But yes, I don't know for sure. If we establish something like the Bushfire Act in the United States, we would see a lot more proactive prescribed burning. I am absolutely sure of that. Now, whether the public would accept it or not, I have no idea. That's a good question.
Okay. Well, in addition to being a research fire ecologist, you are also the host of Fire Ecology Chats. How did you begin? How did you begin that?
Okay. Fire Ecology Chats was started because the Association for Fire Ecology, AFI, had a journal called Fire Ecology. The journal, Fire Ecology is the name of the journal that AFI sponsors and hosts, and Fire Ecology is published through Springer. So AFI manages Fire Ecology, and Springer publishes it. And the journal came out in 2000. And it was more or less, wasn't published by Springer then, and it was more or less kind of a homespun journal done by us through contracts. And it went like that until 2000, I think 16. We had 4 editors, and then we were trying to find an editor, and they asked me if I would be managing editor of Fire Ecology in 2016. And I accepted it then, but recognized the fact that if we were going to make the journal stronger, we would need to go with a larger printing organization like Elsevier, Springer, or Wiley. So we went out and touched and asked all of them to submit, proposals, and we decided that Springer should be our publisher. So Fire Ecology, we published, thousands of papers on fire ecology. I think that now we are. Now that we've had 6 years of Springer, we are now the 10th most popular journal in the field of ecology. And we are, there are only 3 other fire ecology kind of journals that really do anything with or that are substantially dedicated to fire ecology. One is the International Journal of Wildland Fire, and their main focus is fire itself, and fire ecology is not really, they were the original journal, but fire ecology really is secondary. Then there's us with fire ecology, and we don't really publish a lot of fire behavior stuff. That's all the International Journal of Fire Ecology and so on. And then there's another journal called Fires, which just started. I don't know what their aim is. In the end, we found through talks with Springer that we could make our paper any paper that got published in fire ecology a lot more popular if we did certain media things. And so we set up and we started, punching it out through all the social media things, through Facebook and we tweeted it through Twitter and so on. But then I got the idea that maybe we should do a podcast. And the aim of the podcast is to condense a paper, have the author tell in the podcast exactly what the paper is all about in less than 5 minutes. And these podcasts were done so that people didn't have to go and read the paper from start to finish, or just read the abstract and understand what the paper was about. They could actually listen while they, do other things to the podcast and decide if they like that paper or not. And if they do, of course, they can go to the website and download it for free. We are open source and so on. So therein started Fire Ecology Chats. And believe it or not, after we published the first 10 Fire Ecology Chats, our downloads increased by almost 27%.
Wow.
Because people really loved this fact that they could download or they could listen to a fire ecology paper over, the internet through a podcast and decide, well, maybe I should read more, or maybe, hey, I know enough about this now so I can implement it in my daily activities, or maybe, this paper doesn't interest me at all. And so we found it to be extremely effective. And unfortunately, which is most bizarre to me, a lot of our authors that we have published decide not to do the podcast, which is, we only have half of them doing podcasts. And those half that do the podcast see their papers skyrocket with downloads. So it is become a very popular thing for both the authors and the people that read them. So there was the start of the Fire Ecology Chats, and I think I love to do them. It's very fun. I know most of these people, obviously, and I have worked with them or done some stuff with them, and it's great getting back and touching base with friends and colleagues, and along with listening to them understand and find out exactly the new stuff that they're doing. So I love doing the podcast, and I think everybody else likes them too. So they're available at the AFI website, or you can go to the Fire Ecology Journal website and get them. And they are designed to be between 5 and 7 minutes long and very quick.
Yes, and we'll link. What was that?
No, I hope is that what you wanted, Chris?
Yes, that was it. And we'll link to that to those sites that you just mentioned. And
hopefully there is a lot less scientific lingo in the podcast, and it's really meant for the layperson and not for scientists. And so as a result, a lot of our podcast downloaders or listeners are managers or just people who want to find out. As a matter of fact, when a podcast comes out, we have several schools that download our podcast to their kids so they can learn about fire ecology.
That's awesome. And, I understand, scientists or, many people don't have the interest to speak publicly, to have their words published for, whoever knows how long it's, on the internet. And so it's understandable that they don't, want to speak about, they love their research, I'm sure, but they maybe don't feel comfortable. But it's, as I thanked you before that we started recording, because I've read a few of these papers and I've listened to your podcast. And like you said, getting the scientists on there, the scientist will tell you exactly what he wants you to receive out of his or her paper, both genders. And so it's so much easier, like you said, 5 to 7 minutes. And I think you do a great job of, you get your host on the podcast and you just, you're able to really get the story that they're looking to tell from the paper that they wrote. And I was able to find you and listen to these stories and understand that fire ecology is really complicated, how it affects animals, how prescribed fires affect foliage and animals, and how Europe is facing different problems than America. It's it is, like you said, much easier to digest and much less technical.
Yeah. The other thing we do now is, along with the podcasts, we have several special issues or special collections of papers that we have. And this is where scientists go out and ask other scientists to write papers in a certain category or topic, and then we'll publish all those papers as a special collection. And in the future, we're going to have webinars that will have, 10-minute snippets of these papers that are in the special collection talked about by the authors themselves. So we're between webinars, we're going to record them, obviously, and podcasts, where we're able to get out our content that we have on the website, on the Springer website, so people can download it and see. And again, is that, the papers are free. I don't want, there's no money involved. The papers are free. We publish open source. The authors pay that charge. And so it's just one way to get fire ecology information out to the masses that we especially enjoy.
I think it's one of them, it was the most effective way to get fire ecology information to me at the minimum. Bob, thank you so much for this podcast. I know you mentioned that if there's one thing that the audience should take away, it's that there are different environments. You have to look at the local system to understand how fire is going to play in within the ecology. Is there anything other than, really understanding that systems are localized that you'd like the audience to take away?
The other thing I think is that the solution to our fire enigma or dilemma is not going to please every person. And I guess I would, not only be patient, be tolerant that, it may involve some cutting, some logging, some prescribed burning, generating smoke, and that if the general public is going to accept the next phase that we go to in fire management, it will probably involve, something that they don't agree with and so on. But they will have to be a little tolerant, and let's see how these fuel treatments work. Let's see how fire management works in the future. I'm not saying we should get rid of all suppression activities. Obviously, we need those around. But I think that the future of fire management lies in the appropriate use of three things: fire suppression techniques, allowing fires to burn, which we often call the let burn policies or whatever. And then the third thing is a creative mix of fuel treatment designs, which will allow us to attack tomorrow's fire situations and be able to at least mitigate adverse effects of future fires under climate change. And Koresh, I had a wonderful time. Thanks so much for inviting me on your podcast. I really appreciate it. And it was just such a fun time to talk with you about fire ecology and so on for the last hour.
Thank you so much, Bob. I appreciate you coming on as well. Bye.
Bye.